Thanks, Tanine, and thanks, Loz, also for sitting on this panel. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people, and the stolen land that we're standing on. My name's Rei Alfonso. Flat Out has already been introduced. Those of you who've seen me speak know that sometimes in 10 minutes I might get about 3 sentences in, so what poor sucker is responsible for timekeeping me? You? Can I get a 5 minutes and then frantic hand signals when I'm getting towards the end? Okay, cool, great. I work for Flat Out, statewide homelessness services, as already was said. So I have a history of working in the PVOR space, but I'm not in a role like that right now. But I'm very, very interested in the way that interpersonal experiences of violence and experiences of state and structural violence are inherently interconnected. And that's been really beautifully tabled today by the panels and speakers that we've already had. And I look forward to drilling down into that in the workshops later in the day. So as other speakers have alluded to, Victoria's women's prison population is rapidly expanding. And the overwhelming majority of incarcerated women are victims of family violence in childhood and adult life. So corrections puts that at somewhere around 70%, but all peak peer-led organisations, including Sisters Inside, put that at 100%. So we might say that whilst not all women who experience violence are criminalised, all criminalised women experience some form of family violence. I like dazzle tactics when it comes to data. Some of you might have seen these before. I'll just go through them quickly because I hope that none of this will be a surprise to anybody in the room. But this is a graph depicting the number of the increase in the women's prison population. So between 2008 and 2018. So 137.8%, and I believe that's actually increased since this survey was done. And then importantly, 406% for Aboriginal women. 406% in the last 10 years, largely due, which I'm sure Loz will drill down into, to the increase in bail laws and the tough on crime approach that our government has taken. So who are these laws keeping our communities safer from? These are some, I love a good pie chart. You don't have to necessarily absorb the numbers, but I think it's an interesting visual juxtaposition. So here we have the differences, the disparity in statistics for non-criminalised women and criminalised women in their experience of homelessness. And we know that for women leaving prison, even if they are then, ticked and flicked as having been released into secure housing, that housing tends to break down between 6 and 12 weeks. So here we have non-criminalised women and then criminalised women experiencing 44% of insecure housing. Experiences of poor mental health or distress, 13.5% versus 63%, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand how this might actually be underreporting. Most of these surveys are done by corrections, and there are many, many reasons why women would choose not to disclose mental distress to corrections, including fear of that impacting, say, their right to have access to their children or their ability to engage other services. Experiences of misusing alcohol and other drugs, so that's 9% versus 17%, versus 83%. And then experiences of family violence. And again, this is taken from corrections, so I put a median and put 90%, but all the peer organisations would say 100%. So we're all familiar with the 23%, about a quarter of women experiencing interpersonal violence, and then 90% for criminalised women. So I'll just go back over those because I think that, that is a really stark visual juxtaposition for who it is that we're talking about and who it is that we are supposedly being kept safe from. So what does this mean for PVOR work? And I've included the socio-ecological model from Our Watch because this is, of course, the framework that we're currently using to underpin a lot of PVOR work. And basically, that's looking at the structures, norms and practices that impact on individual, interpersonal, organisational, community and societal prevention of violence, or the gender drivers that contribute to violence against women. And what does that mean in terms of our practice? So I've drawn some correlations between key themes that I've identified in the early stages of my project, which has been going since January. So something that a lot of women... How am I going for time? Am I about halfway? Yeah. Great. Okay, cool. So a common theme is misidentification as the primary aggressor, which obviously comes down a lot harder on women. The more structural disadvantage a woman faces, the more likely she is to be misidentified as a primary aggressor. And we're talking about things as, the cross orders being served on the same day. I worked with a client in my previous role who was served with a cross order while she was unconscious in the back of an ambulance on the same day. It really is this ludicrous. And perpetrators using the system as a highly effective form of power and control. And this correlates with the controlled decision making, which we understand as one of the foundational gendered drivers of violence. And I think that this is really important for our work because I've never met people who are more well-versed in how to leverage the system against a woman than a perpetrator of violence. And do we, as PVOL workers and women engaged, people engaged in work in this space, wanting to increase safety for women and children in this state, do we want to be colluding in a system that is daily impacting, having a profound impact on the level of interpersonal harm that women are facing in their homes? And then the impact of criminalisation on a woman's ability to seek support from family violence services. As Tarneen touched on, having a criminalised history, coming from a criminalised family, having a violent crime on your record, for example, if you have been served with an abusive cross order, that then impacts your ability to enter refuge, to enter supported accommodation, to go into a group program, to access transitional housing. And then historical and cultural trauma compounded by ongoing experiences of stigma and discrimination. So that is the, over time, that drip, drip, drip effect of a lifetime of negative experiences of engaging with police, of engaging with child protection, of engaging with the courts, that are going to prevent those systems from ever being therapeutic or protective for an individual woman. And again, what does that mean for us and for our practice? And what that means, I think the part of the rollout is, self-exclusion and disengagement is a key protective strategy. 5 minutes? Great. When our work is inherently based on compliance, on women being able to meet our requirements for accessing service, when they are self-excluding and disengaging as a smart and reasonable and sane response to historical and cultural experiences of discrimination, then it is not they who are falling short, it is us and our services. Poor literacy and collaboration between the service system and the justice system creates specific barriers for criminalised women. I can't tell you the number of times that I've sat in a courtroom and have a magistrate say that a woman can access bail for some minor crime and be located in the community with her family where she belongs if she accesses a cognitive assessment or goes to detox in the next 4 weeks. And I sit there and I look at this guy and I'm like, well, she would really like that and I would really like that, but where is that going to come from and who the hell is going to pay for it? And then gendered understandings of violence, this idea of the ideal victim versus the bad woman or the bad mother, and the impact of that individually on an internalised stigma level that again reinforces that self-exclusion from accessing services, down to how these women are assessed. They're non-compliant, they're difficult to engage. I understand deeply, I've got 15 years in case management behind me, and I understand the allure of the too hard basket that is very much built on this idea of the good woman and the good mother and the right victim, but we must resist this in our work. So, linking women's experience of interpersonal and state violence, and what does this mean for my practice? And I'm about halfway, right? So that was my Dazzle Tactics presentation, but basically where I want to tie it into a bow for you is that, prevention of violence work is about increasing safety. And in a capitalist context, and just a sidebar, I am so stoked to be at an event where within 5 minutes somebody said, smash the state. Thank you, great, fantastic, need to hear that more. But in the capitalist context, safety is reduced to comfort. And safety is a loading zone. It's not a highway. Change work, mobilising, being on the front line is incredibly uncomfortable, and it requires all of us to give up comfort and safety and also to create more space so that Indigenous women can collectivise and heal. Right now in this state, there are hundreds of women who, if mobilised and given the space and the resources and the support to be on the front line, would be some of our most outspoken and still are finding ways to be some of our most outspoken and important activists. The voices of women in prison, the voices of women on the pointy end of structural disadvantage, those are political prisoners, and we need to stop pretending that we don't have those in this country. Often at the moment, all the time in the moment, we talk about intersectionality. We talk about understanding prevention of violence work, about understanding our gender-based violence work, our response work from an intersectional lens. And I just want to stress that if our work is anything explicitly anti-racist, then that is a misappropriation of the history of intersectionality. Intersectionality is not a substitute buzzword for diversity. We don't pick out gender and class and race and put them in different boxes. Gender, yes, gender drivers of violence, but gender is just as indivisible from a person's experience of violence as any other axis along which we accord power. Race, ability, class. And if we don't acknowledge that, then it's like picking apart and discussing the cart before we've even looked at the horse or the road or where it is that we are going. You know, and not to belabor or beat everybody about the head. I know that we're all here because we're due on 1 minute warning. Okay, all right. So, in a nutshell, trans and gender diverse women are our core work. Indigenous women in prison are our core work. Women living with disabilities are our core work. Women using substances are our core work. Women who are homeless and insecurely housed are our core work. They are not a collective on the side. They are not a special interest group. Intersectional, true work to unpack people, it starts from the pointy end and it works backwards. If we are working to dignify and uplift the voices of black women in prison, then there is no way that we can't provide more transformative and empowering support for everybody. But it requires us to embrace being uncomfortable. We can't talk about migrant women without talking about borders. We can't talk about liberation without talking about prisons. We can't talk about class with talking about capitalism. So we are under contract. We've been offered and we've accepted Wurundjeri. That means that we have to pay the rent. That means that we have to be uncomfortable. That means that we have to stand in solidarity. Not within the system, but around, despite and against. Protest and disrupt, not protect, the carceral state. Consider the fact that many women who have significant cause to disrupt are currently incarcerated. Political prisoners, liberate their voices, stand for all. Thank you.